There was something about the stillness of the lake that soothed Ethan's soul. After nearly 2 decades of city noise, cramped apartment walls, and the relentless hum of traffic, he had finally traded it all for a quiet slice of heaven just beyond the tree line. His modest home sat on a gentle slope that rolled down toward the water, flanked by pine and cedar trees. It wasn't extravagant, but it was his dream. Peaceful, private, and surrounded by nature. Ethan had always been more at ease with a fishing rod in his hand than with small talk at cocktail parties. A software engineer turned remote freelancer, he now had the freedom to work from anywhere, and he'd chosen here. The very first weekend after moving in, he built a simple wooden gate along the back of his property, leading directly to the lake. It wasn't fancy, just a sturdy fence with a lock and a clean path to the water. That gate, for him, was a symbol of everything he'd earned. A personal threshold between the noisy life he left behind and the tranquil existence he'd built. At first, life by the lake was idyllic. Morning coffee on the deck, the occasional heron gliding over the water, and no one to bother him. The neighbors kept to themselves, mostly retirees or weekenders with boats. Ethan liked it that way, but as with most places that looked too perfect, there was one blemish in the landscape: the HOA. At first, the Homeowners Association was just a background presence. A few emails here and there, the occasional reminder about trash pickup or lawn length. Ethan didn't mind. He even thought it was useful. Until she appeared. Her name was Cheryl, but everyone in the neighborhood had started calling her Karen behind closed doors, and it didn't take long for Ethan to understand why. Cheryl was the kind of woman who always walked like she owned the place, clipboard in hand, sunglasses on her head even when it was cloudy. She was the HOA president, self-appointed protector of community standards, and an expert in the art of making small issues seem like federal offenses. The first time she came up his driveway, it was to remind him that his mailbox was 2 inches taller than the community guideline allowed. That's when Ethan realized peace might live by the lake, but it had a nosy neighbor. It wasn't long before Cheryl began asking questions about the gate. Innocent ones at first. "Oh, did you install that yourself?" Or, "I think lake access is supposed to be shared." Ethan answered politely, letting her know the gate was on his deeded land, installed legally, and strictly for private use. She didn't push then, but her eyes lingered on the lock a little too long before she walked away. For Ethan, it was a red flag. He'd heard stories about controlling HOAs, but never thought he'd become the next cautionary tale. Still, he didn't want to jump to conclusions. Maybe she was just overly enthusiastic about neighborhood unity. Maybe she'd drop it. But as he turned back toward the lake that day, a quiet thought whispered at the back of his mind. A gut instinct that comes when something isn't quite right. This wasn't the end of it. It was just the beginning. Hey, real quick, if you're enjoying the video so far, make sure to hit that like button, share it with friends, and subscribe for more awesome content. And while you're at it, drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. All right, let's keep going. It was a Tuesday morning when the knock came. Ethan had just brewed his second cup of coffee, laptop open and resting on the kitchen island, when 3 short, deliberate raps echoed through the wooden door. He glanced at the camera feed. There she was again, clipboard in hand, lips pursed like she'd sucked a lemon for breakfast. Cheryl. He sighed, set down his mug, and opened the door with a practiced smile that said, "Let's get this over with." "Good morning, Ethan," Cheryl chirped, her tone wrapped in a faux-friendly coating that couldn't quite mask the power trip underneath. She wore a coral windbreaker today and held a manila folder tucked under her arm like a secret weapon. "Morning," Ethan replied, leaning against the frame. "I'm just here to follow up on a concern that's come up in the last HOA meeting." She didn't wait for an invitation and instead launched straight into her speech. "It's about your gate, the one leading to the lake." Ethan nodded slowly. "What about it?" "Well," she said, flipping open the folder with theatrical flair. As you know, the lake is considered a shared community amenity. The HOA has decided that any private access to the lake should be made available to all residents. It's only fair, he blinked. You want what? We're requesting a copy of your gate key, she said, handing over a printed letter bearing the HOA's official letterhead. Just for shared access. It's not right that one resident enjoys exclusive entry while others have to walk around the entire loop trail. Ethan scanned the paper. It was dressed up in formal language, phrases like community cohesion and equitable resource allocation. But at its core, it was a demand. They wanted his key. To his gate. On his land. He looked back up, keeping his voice even. Cheryl, that gate is on my private property. I confirmed it's within my deeded lot lines before I ever installed it. The path behind it isn't HOA maintained. It's an old fishing trail. I'm not handing over a key. Her smile thinned. I understand your concern, but the board feels strongly that lake access shouldn't be monopolized. Ethan chuckled, but there was no humor in it. I'm not monopolizing anything. I just happen to live next to the water. I didn't realize having a good backyard view came with guilt trips. There was a flicker of frustration behind her eyes, but she quickly masked it with another sugary grin. I'll be sure to let the board know your position. Of course, we hope this doesn't become a formal issue. Ethan watched her turn and strut back down the driveway, that coral windbreaker fluttering like some passive-aggressive flag of war. He closed the door slowly, letter still in hand, and leaned his back against it. This wasn't just a neighborly dispute anymore. Cheryl wasn't asking. She was laying the foundation for something bigger. He could feel it in her tone, in the legalese wording of the letter, in the way she emphasized formal issue, like it was some looming threat. Back in the kitchen, he sat down at his laptop and began drafting an email to his lawyer friend, Max. It wasn't that Ethan wanted a fight, but he wasn't about to be bullied off his own land either. The lake outside shimmered like it always did. But now, it felt different, a little less peaceful. The first knock had come, and it wouldn't be the last. If the first knock was a warning shot, what followed felt more like an organized siege. By the end of the week, Ethan had received not one but 3 letters from the HOA, each thicker and more formal than the last, like they were trying to drown him in paper cuts. The wording shifted from requests to compliance expectations, and then finally to thinly veiled threats about possible penalties for obstruction of community access. Cheryl's name was signed on every one, always in her perfect cursive, always accompanied by the HOA's gold-embossed seal like it meant something. Ethan didn't respond, not because he didn't care, but because he knew better than to take the bait. He'd dealt with enough bureaucracy in his former life to recognize when someone was trying to push him into reacting emotionally. That's how they won, by dragging people into their maze of petty rules and technicalities until you gave in just to make the noise stop. But Ethan wasn't wired that way. If they wanted to play games, he was ready to play defense. That weekend, he drove into town and picked up 2 motion sensor security cameras, nothing fancy, just enough to cover his backyard and the area around the gate. It wasn't paranoia, it was preparation. The first strange thing he caught on video happened just 3 nights later. At around 11:43 p.m., the camera's infrared picked up a figure, hood up, walking slowly along the property line. They paused near the fence, fiddled with something near the gate, then walked off when the porch light suddenly clicked on. Ethan reviewed the footage the next morning and paused on the image. Whoever it was had gloves on and didn't stay long, but the implication was loud and clear. Someone had tried to open the gate. His blood didn't boil. It simmered. He didn't call the cops just yet. Instead, he saved the clip and backed it, up twice. He printed stills, placed them in a folder with the letters he'd received, and started keeping a log of everything. Dates, times, strange sounds, cars parked too long on the street. If Cheryl and her band of HOA henchmen wanted a war, then Ethan would give them one, with a paper trail strong enough to choke a courthouse printer. Then came the whispers. At first it was just a passing comment from his mail carrier. "Heard, you're not sharing the lake anymore." Then a neighbor he barely knew, watering her flowers across the street, made a pointed joke. "Careful with that gate, Ethan. Might start a civil war in the cul-de-sac." Word was spreading. Fast. Cheryl had clearly been working the neighborhood like a politician on election week, twisting the story to paint Ethan as the villain. The greedy homeowner hoarding the lake like it was his personal treasure. He could, almost hear her voice. "It's not about the gate. It's about fairness, community, unity," all while ignoring that it wasn't her property, her gate, or her right. One afternoon, while sitting on the back porch with his coffee, Ethan noticed a car slow down near his fence. It didn't stop, but the driver leaned slightly toward the passenger window and pointed directly at the gate. Another neighbor? A curious HOA member? Or just someone following orders? Ethan didn't wave. He just watched. It was no longer about lake access. That much was clear. This had become personal for Cheryl. A mission, a crusade, whatever label made her feel important. And like all self-righteous crusaders, she was dangerous. Not because she was right, but because she believed she was. That night Ethan sat at his desk, flipping through the folder of documentation. Every page he added made him feel a little more grounded. He didn't want to fight, but if it came to that, he'd be ready, with facts, footage, and legal backing. He glanced out the window toward the gate, silhouetted in the moonlight at the bottom of his yard. A lock hung on it, still intact, still holding strong. So was he, and Cheryl? She didn't know it yet, but she just picked a fight with the wrong man. By now, Ethan wasn't surprised when the next envelope arrived in his mailbox. Another letter bearing the HOA's seal, thicker this time and far more confident in tone. It practically strutted its way out of the envelope. The letter began with the usual pleasantries and then took a sharp turn. In accordance with recently passed Bylaw 14C, all private lake access points must be made available to residents upon HOA request. Failure to comply within 7 days may result in fines or legal action. Ethan blinked. A new bylaw? Passed when? He hadn't received notice of any vote. There had been no meeting announcement, no minutes shared, and certainly no community consensus. He wasn't an HOA board member, but he knew how the process worked. And this? This felt like smoke and mirrors dressed in legalese. He set the letter down and grabbed his phone. 20 minutes later, he was on a video call with Max, his college buddy turned real estate attorney, who had been following the saga with a mix of amusement and growing concern. Ethan held the letter up to the camera. "Tell me this isn't real," Max snorted. "It's not. That's not how bylaws work. They can't just create new rules and apply them retroactively to private property, especially not property that falls outside their jurisdiction. You told me the gate sits fully within your deeded land, right? Confirmed it twice. Even walked it with the county's parcel map. Then it's a bluff. A loud one, but still a bluff." Ethan leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair. "So what now? They're clearly not stopping. Document everything. Don't respond directly. Let them make the next move, and if they cross a legal line, we file back. I can help." It was a relief to hear, but Ethan also knew people like Cheryl rarely backed down quietly. Sure enough, the next HOA newsletter featured a bolded blurb. On page 2, residents are reminded that the HOA board recently voted on Bylaw 14C regarding fair access to lakefront pathways. We encourage unity and community-minded cooperation. There it was. No mention of legal boundaries, no clarification on what counted as lakefront, and certainly no admission that it was likely unenforceable. Just enough carefully worded propaganda to stir the pot without spilling any facts. That week, things began to feel more tense than ever. Neighbors who used to nod politely now seemed unsure whether to wave or glare. A couple of kids tossed rocks toward his dock as they rode by on their bikes, giggling. Ethan wasn't mad at the kids. It was clear someone else had planted the narrative. That guy's the selfish one, the man hoarding nature, the one who won't share. Then, it happened. It was around 2:15 in the morning. Ethan had trouble sleeping. Something about the silence outside felt off. He got up, made some tea, and checked the backyard camera feed, like he'd done every night for the past week. And there it was. Motion detected. A figure crouched near the gate, lit up in black and white infrared. They were holding something. Bolt cutters. Ethan's heart kicked into gear. He grabbed his phone, hit record, and zoomed in. The person, hooded again, struggled for a few seconds with the lock, clearly not expecting the metal to hold up. When the porch floodlight clicked on automatically, the intruder flinched and bolted, cutting through the side yard and disappearing into the trees. The lock was damaged but intact. Ethan didn't bother going outside. He just exhaled slowly, saved the footage, and added a new entry to the log. Attempted lock break-in. 2:15 a.m. Suspect unidentified. Recorded. He stared out at the lake, moonlight shimmering gently across the surface. This was why he'd moved out here, to escape the noise, the crowds, the constant stress of city life. And somehow, he'd found himself in a neighborhood cold war over a gate, over a view. But now, it wasn't just principle. It was trespassing, vandalism, harassment, and Ethan was done playing nice. Ethan wasn't the type to spy on his neighbors. He had always believed in privacy, both his and everyone else's. But something about how quiet things had gotten lately made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. No letters, no knocks, not even another botched attempt at cutting the lock. It was too quiet. So when his neighbor, old George, from 2 doors down, mentioned something offhandedly about that special HOA meeting at Cheryl's place, Ethan's ears perked up. There had been no notice, no official agenda shared. Which meant one thing. They didn't want everyone to know. And if it was about the gate, Ethan wasn't about to let it happen in the dark. He pulled out a small voice recorder he'd used years ago for interviews, charged it up, and tucked it into the inner pocket of his jacket. That evening, he parked 2 streets over, took the back trail through the woods, and crouched behind a cluster of shrubs along the edge of Cheryl's backyard. Her patio lights were on, and the sliding door was cracked open just enough for sound to travel. Inside, 6 people gathered in a tight circle, sitting on folding chairs and sipping wine like they were planning a barbecue instead of, as it turned out, a borderline criminal conspiracy. "We just cut the damn lock," Cheryl said, her voice clipped and assertive. "It's not about what's on his deed. It's about community access. That gate belongs to all of us, whether he likes it or not." A murmur of hesitant agreement followed, though one man, Larry, Ethan thought, sounded unsure. "But legally, can we even—" "We'll deal with it after. Once the gates open, no one's going to argue. The neighborhood will be on our side. If we wait for some drawn-out legal process, he wins. We act now." Ethan's hand tightened around the recorder in his pocket. He knew Cheryl was bold, but this wasn't just HOA overreach. This was premeditated trespass, maybe even destruction of property. And she was saying it in front of witnesses who were too polite or too scared to push back. He listened for another 10 minutes, recording every word. They talked about timing, late on a Friday night. They joked about wearing gloves. One person even offered to bring their teenage son, since he's good with tools. That's when it hit Ethan. They weren't just playing games anymore. This was real trouble. He backed away from the shrubs carefully, heart pounding, adrenaline rising with every step back through the woods. When he got to his truck, he sat there in the dark for a long moment, clutching the recorder like it was gold. Because in a way, it was. That meeting changed everything. Ethan wasn't angry anymore. He was focused, calm, like a man who'd just been handed the final puzzle piece. They thought they were being clever. They thought they could twist the truth, manipulate the rules, and bully him into compliance. But now he had something they didn't expect. Proof. He backed out of the driveway slowly, headlights off until he hit the main road. No need to spook anyone just yet. He knew exactly what his next steps would be. The camera footage, the log, the forged bylaw letter. It had all been damning enough. But this? This was the nail in the coffin. Karen didn't know it yet, but her HOA crusade had just run out of road. It happened on a crisp Saturday morning, the kind where the lake shimmered, like a polished mirror, and the birdsong masked the tension that had been building for weeks. Ethan was sipping his coffee on the back porch, his eyes scanning the yard out of habit, when he saw them. 3 of them. Karen in front, as usual, flanked by 2 HOA board members. Bruce, who always looked like he regretted showing up to these things, and Sharon, who clutched a clipboard like it was a badge of honor. What made this visit different, though, was what Karen was carrying. A pair of bolt cutters swinging casually at her side like a handbag. Ethan set his mug down slowly, heart rate steady but rising. He walked down the steps and met them halfway, across the lawn, expression calm. "Morning," he said flatly. Karen didn't even bother with pleasantries. "We're done playing games," she snapped. "You've ignored the board's decision, and now we're taking back what belongs to the community." Bruce shifted uncomfortably, clearly realizing this was going too far but not brave enough to stop it. Sharon simply clicked her pen and made a note. Ethan didn't flinch. "If you walk one step closer to that gate, it won't end well for you." Karen raised an eyebrow, amused. "What, you gonna sick your ducks on us?" Ethan let a small smile tug at the corner of his mouth. "No, but I did call the sheriff 5 minutes ago." She laughed then, an unrestrained, theatrical cackle like she'd just heard the opening act of a bad joke. "Oh, please. You expect us to believe you're wasting county resources over a neighborhood disagreement?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a manila envelope. He held it out calmly. "This is a cease and desist letter, signed and prepared by my attorney. It outlines your violation of state trespassing laws, the fraudulent bylaw you tried to enforce, and the attempted break-in from last week, which I caught on camera. And just in case you think I'm bluffing..." He paused, taking a step closer, lowering his voice but never his gaze. "I have a full recording of your little secret meeting Thursday night. Every word. Including your plan to cut the dams, lock, and bring your son to help." For the first time, Karen's expression faltered. Just for a split second, her bravado cracked, and Ethan caught a flicker of realization in her eyes. Sharon looked up from her clipboard, suddenly very still. Bruce looked like he wanted to vanish into the grass. Ethan held her gaze. "Now, unless you want to explain this entire stunt to a judge, I suggest you take your clipboard, your bolt cutters, and your inflated sense of entitlement, and get off my property." The air between them was thick with tension, but the power had shifted. Karen's smirk faded as she slowly lowered the bolt cutters to her side. "You think you're so clever," she muttered, her voice now tight with restraint. "No," Ethan said simply. "I just know the law, and I'm done letting." "You pretend you do." The 3 of them turned without another word. Karen's steps were stiff, clipped, like each one stabbed at her pride. Bruce muttered something about getting out while we can. Sharon clutched her clipboard like a shield as they disappeared down the path. Ethan stood there a moment longer, watching until they were gone. The breeze picked up, rustling the trees along the shoreline. He could still hear the birdsong, but it sounded sweeter now, like the calm after a storm that had finally started to pass. This wasn't the end. but it was the line in the sand. And now, everyone knew where it was drawn. It started with the clang of metal on metal. Ethan had just stepped into his shed to grab a wrench when he heard it, the unmistakable clink of bolt cutters snapping shut. He froze, then moved quickly, staying low behind the shed's edge, peeking toward the back of his property. There they were. Karen, again in the lead, her ever-faithful sidekick Sharon with her clipboard, and a younger guy he didn't recognize, likely the handy son she'd mentioned in the secret meeting. They were at the gate. Karen was shouting something about HOA jurisdiction and community rights as the kid fumbled with the bolt cutters, clearly not used to wielding them. Sharon was already scribbling notes as if documenting a crime she was about to commit. Ethan didn't even bother yelling this time. Instead, he pulled out his phone and quietly hit record, just as the sheriff's cruiser rolled up the gravel path. The flashing red and blues lit up the early evening like a fireworks show. Karen turned around mid-sentence, her face a perfect mix of confusion and disbelief. Two more deputies stepped out behind the sheriff, who calmly walked toward the gate like he'd been expecting this all week. Ethan stepped out from behind the shed and met them halfway. He looked composed, even polite, but there was a steel edge behind his eyes. "Afternoon, Sheriff," Ethan said, holding out a USB drive and a thick folder. "Here's everything we talked about. Security footage, the audio from their meeting, and all the written threats they've left in my mailbox." Karen's voice pitched up instantly. "This is ridiculous. We're enforcing our HOA's rules." Sheriff didn't even glance her way. He took the folder, scanned the front page, then gave Ethan a short nod. "Looks like everything's in order. And you've got a copy of the deed?" "Right here," Ethan said, pulling out the laminated document from his back pocket like a magician revealing a final trick. That's when things shifted. Sharon's pen hovered mid-air. The teen lowered the bolt cutters like they were suddenly 10 pounds heavier. "Karen?" She still tried to bluff her way through it. "This is all being blown out of proportion. It's a misunderstanding, not a crime." The sheriff raised an eyebrow. "Trespassing isn't a misunderstanding. Neither is property damage, conspiracy to commit trespass, or tampering with private security equipment, all of which are referenced right here in your own handwriting." He held up one of the printed threats, signed HOA Enforcement Committee. Karen's face drained of color. One of the deputies walked over and gently pulled the bolt cutters from the teen's hands, slipping them into an evidence bag. Another took Sharon's clipboard. She handed it over without a word, eyes wide as she watched Karen's unraveling unfold in real time. "I'm going to have to ask you all to leave the premises immediately," the sheriff continued, voice steady but unmistakably firm. "You'll be contacted for further questioning. If you step foot on this man's property again, it will be under the supervision of a court order or in handcuffs." Karen opened her mouth but said nothing. Ethan stood quietly as they backed away, escorted by the deputies. He didn't gloat, didn't smile. But deep inside, he felt the weight that had hung over him for weeks begin to lift. The gate remained intact. His deed was still valid. And more importantly, the law had finally spoken louder than Karen ever could. As the patrol cars rolled away and dusk settled over the lake, Ethan stood alone by the gate, listening to the gentle lap of water on the shore. The peace he'd built here wasn't just about solitude anymore. It was about standing firm, knowing the truth, and refusing to be bullied out of what was rightfully his. The next few weeks were quiet, in the way that silence settles after a storm, heavy but peaceful. The HOA board sent out a formal apology, backed by an official letter of reprimand for Karen, who was now facing charges of trespassing, harassment, and conspiracy to interfere with private property. The evidence from Ethan's video and audio recordings had sealed her fate, and though the rest of the board had tried to distance themselves, it was too late. Karen's overreach had become the catalyst for a much-needed shakeup in the community. For Karen? Well, she wasn't on the board anymore. The neighborhood rallied behind Ethan in a way that surprised even him. Letters, calls, and messages of support flooded his inbox, and within a month, the HOA had no choice but to replace her with someone far more agreeable, someone who understood the concept of boundaries. Karen's attempts to drag others down with her failed. The community had grown tired of her antics. They wanted peace, not petty power struggles. Ethan, though, stayed largely out of the spotlight. The whole ordeal had taken more of an emotional toll on him than he liked to admit. It wasn't the legal victory that mattered. It was the endless headaches, the constant tension, the feeling of being under siege in his own home. It had changed him, and not in a way he could easily explain. What was once a haven of calm, a quiet escape from the chaos of city life, now felt slightly different. Not worse, just more aware. To seal the deal, Ethan decided it was time to reinforce his privacy. The old wooden gate had served him well, but after everything that had happened, he wasn't taking any chances. He installed a new gate, reinforced, with steel beams and a high-tech security system, complete with cameras. It wasn't just for show. It was a reminder that he was no longer a pushover, a reminder that his peace was something worth protecting. And as an added bonus, the gate had a sleek, modern design that complemented the rustic charm of the house, so it didn't stick out like a sore thumb. As he stood in front of the new, sturdy gate one evening, admiring his work, the sense of accomplishment was more than just about the fence. It was about something deeper, a newfound respect. Not from Karen, certainly, but from everyone else who had seen how far he'd gone to protect his right to peace. Word had gotten around that Ethan wasn't someone to trifle with. His calm demeanor in the face of such an overwhelming situation had earned him quiet admiration from his neighbors, some of whom had been too afraid to speak up in the past. The lake now felt different too. The water seemed clearer somehow, the air fresher. The sense of tranquility that had first drawn Ethan to this place returned, but it wasn't the same. It was richer, more layered. It was as though everyone around him now respected the space he had carved out for himself. People were polite when they passed by, offering quick waves and nods of acknowledgement. The gossipy murmurs of the neighborhood seemed to have quieted, replaced by a cautious but genuine appreciation for the privacy that he had fought so hard to maintain. And even though life had returned to a kind of normalcy, Ethan couldn't quite shake the feeling that he'd become something of a local legend. It wasn't intentional, but word had spread. There was a certain mystique now attached to his name, something that made him stand out in a way he never expected. The guy who stood up to Karen. The guy who put the HOA in its place. He didn't mind it, though. It was a small price to pay for the peace he'd fought for. The lessons learned from all of this lingered in the background of his thoughts, soft, whispers of wisdom that had come through the hard way. And though he knew that the neighborhood would always have its quirks, that some people would never change, Ethan could take comfort in knowing that, for now, the lake was his again. Quiet, still, and uninterrupted. But even more than that, it was a reminder that sometimes the price of peace is standing your ground, no matter who tries to knock at your gate. If you enjoyed this video and want to see the next part, let me know in the comments. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to stay updated. See you in the next one. Your support means the world.